Okay, well, good morning. So my name's Andy Bauer. I'm a geneticist with the Forest Service. I'm located here in Olympia. The talk that I'm going to give today is actually was completely put together by Brad St. Clair. Brad is a research geneticist with the Forest Service at the Pacific Northwest Research Station down in Corvallis. He wasn't able to be here today, so and I work quite a lot with Brad, and he asked if I could pinch hit for him. So hopefully, I've got all of his notes. So hopefully, I can do his presentation justice. So the focus of the talk is going to be on adaptation, both at the species and within species level. And we'll try to make the point that one of the most powerful management tools that you have to ensure long-term health, diversity, and productivity of your forest is the choice of both species and seed source for reforestation. There was a lot of some of the burning questions that came up, a lot of talk about which species to use and so forth, but I think Dave, kind of set this up pretty well. He mentioned that, there's also variation within species that also needs to be considered. So one of the most important decisions that you can make as a forest manager is how you reforest the lands. The first question is, are you going to go with natural regeneration or planting? If you can get sufficient stocking of the desired species in a reasonable time frame naturally, then that's a good option. If you can't, then planting, may be in order. Then can you improve the productivity using select planting stock? If you want to use genetically improved materials, then planting, is probably going to be in order. Local. Then will the trees that you end up with be adapted? Local species and seed sources are the default choice, and obviously those are implied if you're using natural regeneration. But maybe you want to consider other seed sources or other species, especially with concerns about maladaptation to future climates. So then you have, the choice of species and the choice of seed source. What species and seed sources seed sources are available to you, and what will be adapted in both in the current and in the future. And planting will become more important in the future because of climate change. So the main premise of the talk is that, in general, plants are adapted to their local climate. Every species, every population, every individual plant has a range of climates in which they can best survive, grow, and reproduce. And because of natural selection at a location, we can assume that plants are adapted to their local climate. In the previous talk, Dave, he showed the USDA plant hardiness zones. Or if anyone is, gardeners have used the Sunset Guide to Gardening, that's what you would use to determine whether a particular plant would be suitable for your garden. Well, that's exactly the same premise, the basis for the seed zones for forest trees. So, climates are changing, though, and that then affects adaptation. Populations of forest trees are genetically adapted to their historic climate. It's represented here, by this temperature gradient and, the lower, maybe this is lower elevation, warmer temperatures. Those populations are adapted, and the higher elevation, colder environments, those local populations are adapted. And I did want to point out that we need to remember that adaptation occurs at the population level, not the individual level. So, we don't think about an individual tree adapting to a future climate, but it's through that natural selection and its reproduction and its offspring that reproduce that would then be that drives adaptation. But with the future climate warming, Where climates have warmed by about 0.7 to 1 degrees Celsius in the Pacific Northwest, and by mid-century, as we saw from Jessica's talk, we can expect increased warming, and so in the future these populations are likely to be mismatched to the future climate. And we're probably going to start to see reductions in productivity and increased mortality. This is a picture of mortality in ponderosa pine down in California, after the ongoing droughts that they've had there. And in some places, climate change may be enough that it moves beyond the climate niche of the species, and maybe another species might be a better choice. But most often, we're going to use species that have been present at this site, for a long time. But if we're considering other species, especially with a changing climate, one of the ways we can decide on the suitability of a species for a planting site is using environmental niche modeling. It's also called climatic niche modeling, species distribution modeling, climate envelope modeling. There are a number of different things that it's been called. And this is a correlative process. So basically, the environment is represented by climate, and the presence of a species is correlated to that particular climate. There's some criticism of this method that it doesn't always reflect the actual species distribution, and that's a valid criticism. There are other factors, that would need to be considered. There's soils and other things. But it doesn't invalidate the value of considering whether the climate is right for a particular species at a particular location. This graphic here is from a paper by Rehfeldt et al., where they did this environmental niche modeling. This is for Douglas fir. The two colors represent the coastal variety and the inland variety. And with this modeling, they calculated their error rates. And for areas where they predicted that Douglas fir would occur, but it's actually absent, is about 5%. So that's not bad. But if their error rates where they predicted that it was not there, but it actually did occur, was only about 0.5%. So that's a pretty small error rate. So I think this type of modeling can be very useful. So one of the important values of this climatic niche modeling is that we can then use future climate models to project what might happen to the potential habitat for a species given a changing climate. So in this same work here, they did calculate, model the predicted climate niche for Douglas fir by 2060. And the differences in color here, the dark colors are lost habitat. The middle color is where it remains stable, and the lighter color is where habitat has been gained. Usually the habitat is lost at the trailing edge of the species distribution. So that would be lower elevations or further to the south. And habitats gained at the leading edge, which usually is higher elevations and further to the north. And you can see that for the coastal variety, about 82% of the species niche is stable and remains suitable. There's a loss of about 18% and a gain of about 18%. So, overall, things are fairly consistent. For the inland variety, there's a little bit less gained than lost, so there is a small percentage loss there. And that's by 2060. But it's critical to realize that there is variation within species with respect to adaptation. So just because the model says that a species might exist in a location now or in the future doesn't necessarily mean that population that's at that location currently will continue to exist in the future, or that it'll be adapted to that future. So this set of papers, these figures come from a set of 3 papers that are all published at the same time by Rayfelt et al. They didn't just look at the climatic niche of the species, but also with variation within the species. And so that variation was divided into what are called climate types, which basically show genetic variation. So these are represented by the different colors. So within a color would be what they considered sort of populations adapted to that local climate. And he found that in the coastal variety, at the species level, there was about 82% of the current climate niche remaining in the future. But when you look at the population level, at these climate types, it was only about 58% of the current population that was adapted to a climate would be adapted in the future. And then for the inland variety, it's a much more drastic situation here, where 68% across the whole species is adapted, but only 1% at the local level. So this is an important point. You need to consider the suitability of seed sources or populations in addition to the species niche, or you might be selecting seed sources that are not adapted to the current or future climates. And I'll get back to this idea of the suitability of the native populations a little bit later on when I talk about the seed lot selection tool. So those are the species considerations. So now I'm going to move on to looking at the potential habitat of the species. So the first question is whether or not the climate of a planting site would even support the species. So Brad and his team developed this web-based interactive tool to consider species potential habitat. This is the species potential habitat tool. So it's designed to help forest managers identify species or vegetation types that are suitable for specific sites given climate change projections, allowing the transition of forest to species compositions that are better suited to future climates. And it has a number of really useful features. You can zoom into your particular area of interest. You can look at different time periods and different climate projections. And it's integrated with the seed lot selection tool, so these two tools can work together. So let's look at what the tool looks like when you open it up. So the first thing you want to do is select the species you're interested in. Right now there's only 5 species, but there's going to be more that are added in the future. So if we click on Douglas fir, this shows the historic distribution of Douglas fir. And so this is the historic distribution. So this is for using data from the climate normal, the 30-year period from 1961 through 1990. And then we select the time period that we're looking towards in the future. There's 2011 to 2040, 2041 to 2070, 2071 to 2100. And the climate models here, there's the 4.5, which is the, I guess, more optimistic, the 8.5, kind of the business as usual. And then what the model will show is the predicted distribution. So this is for that 2011 to 2040 for the business as usual. So the areas in yellow are the habitat that is lost. The green is the habitat kept, and the blue is the habitat gained. This is the same figure, but for the next time period. So you can see the yellow, the habitat lost increases, but so does the habitat gained. And then the last time period, and so you can see the changes over time. So if we go back to the historic distribution, 2040, 2070, 2100. The other thing that this tool can do is that you can overlap both of the climate scenarios. So there are subtle color differences that show the changes based on the two different climate predictions. And then, so here's just another example. This is for ponderosa pine, for the end of century, with the business as usual projection. And you can see, for this species, there's quite a dramatic change from the current. Very little green, lots of yellow, lots of blue. So you're looking at potential really large scale shifts in species niche over time. So that's looking at the choice of species. In general, you're probably still going to favor the species that are local to the planting site, at least for the next few decades, unless you're at the warming edge of the species range and you're starting to see problems. Now, if most of you are local here in the Puget Sound area, we're not necessarily at those southern or species boundaries, but some of the lower elevation areas may experience enough changes in the next few decades that that we might start to see problems. And as we saw earlier, we're already starting to see some problems with some species, with the hemlock and cedar. Which indicates that maybe that the local seed sources is no longer adapted. So we're going to look at the seed source considerations, and there's 5 key points with respect to the adaptation of populations that I want to cover, and these are the ideas behind the seed lot selection tool. So the first point is that genetic variation across the landscape tracks climatic gradients. And this is taken as evidence for local adaptation. And this genetic variation needs to be considered if you want to maintain adaptive and productive forest stands. So how do we know there's genetic variation? We use common garden studies. And so one type of common garden study is called a gene ecology study. So gene ecology is the study of variation in plant species in relation to their environment of the seed source. And consistent correlations indicate the adaptation as determined by natural selection. So these common garden studies are usually short-term. They don't have a field environment. And it doesn't directly test adaptation per se. What it does is it looks at the measurements of traits that are thought to be adaptive. So here's an example. This is Brad's work, this Douglas fir gene ecology study. They collected seed from parent trees extensively covering the range of Douglas fir in Oregon and Washington. They take those seed, they grow seedlings, they grow them in these raised garden beds. The idea being that the phenotype, so what you see in the plant, is a component of the genotype and the environment. And there's differences in environment and differences in genotype. But if we grow them all in the same environment, we're removing that environment component of the phenotypic variation. So any variation you see in those seedlings that you're growing is related to the genotype or the genetics. So they grow these, they measure a whole suite of traits that may be adaptive, like height growth, bud burst, bud set, cold tolerance, things like that. Then they can relate those traits to the environment of the source. So, this is growth here plotted against the December minimum temperature of the seed source. And this range of values here can be then mapped using GIS to illustrate genetic variation. Presumably the parents have heritable characteristics that allowed them to grow, survive, and reproduce in a past environment, at that location and produced progeny that would express those characteristics. And looking at some of the different traits, we see patterns of genetic variation. For example, fall cold damage, bud set, biomass, bud burst. So these QST values here, these are an indication of the strength of genetic differentiation, or the strength of genetic differences between populations. And what we see, is that populations do differ, and the traits are correlated with their source environments. But also these relationships make sense. If we look at fall cold damage, the areas here in the warmest environments down on the southern Oregon coast experience the most fall cold damage, whereas the populations from the upper elevations in the Cascades and Olympics, they experience the least amount of cold damage. So that makes sense. That matches what we would expect. This is related to bud set, and also bud burst. So different environmental factors may be more or less important for determining adaptation. So number two, field tests also indicate that forest trees are often adapted to local climates. These field tests can also be called provenance tests or reciprocal transplant studies. And these are long-term field sites, again, with extensive sampling of populations that allow two things. Allows us to test the question of local adaptation. Are native populations the best? Or at least are they able to grow and survive well? And how local is local? What happens if you move away from the optimum? And this is what helps to determine the transfer limit, how far you can move seed sources. And the gene ecology studies, those common garden studies, they're usually short term, and they might be done in artificial environments. So they can tell us something about what climate variables are important for adaptation, and the differences between those populations and those variables. But they don't provide a test of local adaptation and the effect of differences between populations in long-term survival, growth, or productivity. And that's what these longer-term field studies do. So this is another study that Brad and his team undertook. It was called the Douglas Fir Seed Source Movement Trial. So they sampled, again, from populations throughout the range of Douglas fir in western Washington and Oregon. And just like the Common Garden study, these were all planted, all of those sources were planted at the same location, but they were planted at multiple different locations, representing both warm and cold environments and low elevation and high elevation environments. So here's, these are kind of three examples. Washington high elevation, this was the coldest and wettest site. Washington low elevation, which would be an intermediate site. And an Oregon low elevation, that would be the warmest and driest site. And what we see from the results, this is for height growth at 8-year plotted against extreme minimum cold temperature, is that local populations are best, or at least approximately. As you see, like in this test site, that blue line there represents the average extreme minimum temperature at that site, and you can see the shape of that curve peaks just about there where that line is. And then as you move away from the optimum, growth or survival decreases. And so the distance that you would be willing to move, depends on that decrease in growth or survival or productivity that you're willing to take. So, population variation around this line, basically that's a good thing. It buffers against the risk of maladaptation. Stepping back here, this is just an aerial view of that test site, and these tests were established in blocks. So I think there were maybe 5 or 6 5 or 6 by 6 blocks, and you can see here, really distinct differences in growth and survival among these blocks. This is again showing that same pattern from the cold higher elevation site, lower extreme minimum temperature, and again the peak is pretty close to that. So the third point is that different species show different patterns of adaptation and different degrees of adaptation. So it's important to do studies of different species to better determine if the species is a specialist or a generalist, and also what climatic variables are most important for adaptation, to be able to determine how far you might be able to move seed sources before we start to see significant decreases in adaptation or productivity. This is again more work from Ray Felt. This is looking at a number of different species in the northern Rockies, and what this shows is the differences in basically frost-free days, or growing season length, essentially, and that's correlated to changes in elevation. So you would have to go 18 days in growing season length in order to see genetic differentiation among populations. And you can see for species like Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, it's a fairly small number. And these are specialist species that have fairly narrow environmental tolerances. They're pretty closely adapted to their local environment. Whereas other species like western red cedar and western white pine, are the growing season differences are much greater before you see genetic differences among those populations. So the next point is that seed zones and seed transfer guidelines have been developed to ensure adaptation. Seed zones have been an important component of reforestation for 60 plus years now. And most of you are probably familiar with seed zones. In Oregon and Washington, the seed zones for forest trees were originally developed in the 60s. They were updated in the 70s. They were fairly general. They weren't species specific. And they reflected what was known about climate and also topography, but they were fairly conservative. The idea being that if we are conservative with where we're moving seed, we're at lower risk than if we're moving seeds large distances. Over time, as we started to do some of those studies like Ray Felt showed with different species and started to learn that different species were specialists versus generalists, those seed zones have been updated. They were most recently updated in the late 90s for both Oregon and Washington. And so they've been expanded most often in a north to south direction. That allows you to still account for elevation. But you can see, here for Douglas fir, which is a specialist species, the seed zones are still smaller relative to red cedar, which is more of a generalist species. And so when we're looking at these seed zones, there's two types of seed transfer systems. There's the traditional fixed seed zones where an area is delineated and the idea is that you can move material from within that zone anywhere within that zone. The other option are what have been called focal point or seed movement guidelines, which basically say that for a given location, you can move seed X miles or X feet in elevation or X degrees in latitude or longitude. It's basically the circles around each point are relative to that point itself. And these both have pros and cons. The problem with these fixed zones is that there's a lot of there can be a lot of variation within a zone. Especially in mountainous terrain, within an area, there can be huge changes in elevation. And so if you're just moving things within a zone, even if you subdivide these fixed zones into elevation bands, you could be inadvertently moving something from a colder source location to a warmer source location, which is going to lead to worsening maladaptation. And one of the problems with the focal point zone is that if you may be moving material between adjacent zones, and you don't really know if that seed source is going to be climatically adapted or not. So a third method has been devised, and this is what they're using in British Columbia. There's kind of a hybrid of the two, these focal zones, where it's really looking at the climate of your source environment and trying to match those climates. So you're not just moving a certain distance or within a zone, but moving maybe between zones to a matched climate. And so the last point then is climates are changing and local populations may no longer be adapted. And so this brings up three questions. Are native populations adapted to current and future climates? If not, how far do we have to go to find populations adapted to a planting site? And so we're looking at assisted migration. And how far should we move a population to ensure that it continues to exist? And so this depends on what climate factors are most important for adaptation. We've seen already that cold temperature and also to a certain extent aridity is important. There may be other factors like continentality, which is say a maritime climate versus a continental climate. The differences between summer and winter temperatures. And this might impact susceptibility to needle diseases and things like that. And then how far climatically can we move a population before growth and survival are unacceptable? Different climatic factors may have different transfer limits that reflect different geographic distances. And in general, we can't move things very far geographically with respect to temperature, but and maybe a little bit further with respect to drought and continentality. In general, we've found that, let me make sure I get it right, that differences in precipitation seem to drive those species niches, whereas differences in temperature are what drive the local adaptation, so those population differences. So that's why we can maybe move a little bit further with respect to precipitation, because it's still going to be, that reflects species ranges as opposed to temperature, which reflect population differences. So I'm going to talk a bit now about this seed lot selection tool. And this was designed to address those three questions. Are native populations adapted to both the current and future climates? If not, how far do we have to go to find populations adapted to a particular planting site? And how far should we move a population to ensure it continues to exist? And so the seed lot selection tool was designed, it can address two objectives. So given a particular planting site, which seed lot is well adapted to today or in the future? Or if you have a particular seed lot in your inventory, where is that going to be well adapted today and in the future? And so this is a really powerful tool for matching seed lots to planting sites. Also to characterizing both the past, the current, and future climates at a site. It also, as you'll see, is really useful in illustrating the potential concerns about climate change and seed planting given these climate change concerns. And also can be really useful for gene conservation given the climate change concerns. So let's look at an example here from using the seed lot selection tool. So this is looking at a location here in the Capitol Forest. So close by here. So this objective here, we want to find seed lots that are adapted to this location. And you can select this location by either clicking on the map at that point, or you can enter the latitude and longitude into the window. You select a region. I suggest just select, just leaving it as automatic. This tool covers all of North America, and just for limiting computing resources has been sort of divided up into like Western North America, Eastern North America, Alaska, Mexico. So the tool will automatically use the region that you select based on the location. So you can just leave it as automatic. You select two climate scenarios. So one is the climate that the seed lots are adapted to, and then the climate of the planting site. Then you select your transfer limit methods, and there's the two choices are either custom or are using seed zones. So the seed zones, these are those Oregon and Washington, those generic zones, and then you can select both the zone and elevation band within that zone here. And then we can we can select the climate variables that we want to include. And when the feedback that I've heard people talk about is when they're using this tool, there's 15 or 20 different climate variables, and so people tend to get bogged down and trying to not knowing which climate variables they should use, and there's so many to choose. The best thing is to keep it simple. And so the example I'm showing here includes mean coldest month temperature. Like I said before, research has shown that temperature is usually the most important climate variable in determining local adaptation. And then we've included mean annual precipitation, just because precipitation is also important, but maybe not as important as temperature. So this here shows the values for those climate variables at that planting site. So the winter minimum temperature here is 3 degrees plus or minus 0.7. That's these are the values for that seed zone. And the annual precipitation, 1522 millimeters, plus or minus about 7 millimeters. So, not a huge amount of variation within that seed zone. But you can adjust those transfer limits. These are fairly narrow limits there, just looking at that seed zone. And so then the question is, okay, well, if we're going to adjust those transfer limits, what do we use? And there's been some work done where they've looked at the variation in these climate variables across elevation bands within each of these seed zones. And without going into all of the details in the interest of time, basically, across the average of all zones, the 5th to 95th percentile for mean annual temperature, degrees C, is about 2 degrees. So if we can use that as our transfer limit, basically plus or minus 2 degrees from the mean coldest month temperature at that planting site. That's going to give you something that is going to be relatively well adapted. And then the precipitation, we showed about 400 millimeters. So, and then we run the tool. So what this map shows now, the color basically from darkest to lightest, darkest shows the closest match to the climate at that location. So basically looking at that recent past, the 1961 to 1990, that 30-year normal, the darkest red colors show areas that have the closest climate match. And then everything else, all the rest of the colors, show areas that are within those transfer limits, the combination of 2 degrees in temperature and 400 millimeters in precipitation. Now, if we look at what we're calling recent climate change, so this is the period 1981 to 2010, you can see that changes already. You know, there's a significant reduction in areas that have a climate match, and if looking at the values of that particular location, the temperature is increased to 3.9 degrees. So an increase in 0.9 degrees in temperature and about 10 millimeters in rainfall. Now looking forward to the 2020 climate, and this is again using that business as usual, the RCP 8.5 model. Now we see about a 1.4 degree increase in temperature at that particular location, and even more of a decrease in climate match. By 2050s, we're starting to see a pretty dramatic change here. We've seen now a 2.5 degree increase. By 2080s, over 4 degrees, and there's absolutely nothing within that local area that matches that current climate. I mean, that's a huge, huge change. So if we zoom out, okay, so then where is there a climate match in the 2080s? So you're looking at here, southern Oregon coast and the northern California coast. So really huge dramatic changes, and I think that's one of the most useful aspects of this seed lot selection tool is just that visual is pretty stunning. And so zoomed out again here, this is for the 2020s, just to be able to see across a larger scale what we're looking at. So 2020s, 2050s, and again the 2080s. So the flip side, the other thing that we can do is so if you have seed that you've collected from that location at Capitol Forest, where could you use that seed? Where could you plant it and have it be adapted? So that's now moving that into the 2020s. You could see that it's really not very well adapted to the local environment, but maybe moving uphill a little bit further to the south, for the 2020s. Again, for the 2050s and 2080s. So you can see these areas. You're looking at east side of the Cascades, northeast part of the Olympic Peninsula and the rain shadow area. So pretty dramatic changes in where that seed is going to be adapted to. This same methodology has been used by some researchers working in the Rocky Mountains. They've basically done the same thing. They've developed this climate smart restoration tool. The principles are the same, but this really focuses on species that are used in restoration projects, so a lot of shrubs and native grasses. Some of the main differences is that the traits that they've used are more appropriate for those species. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm not going to really talk much about it. One of the other potential uses for the seed lot selection tool is for gene conservation. What happens to the climate of a native stand, and where might we be able to establish ex situ planting for gene conservation for rare species. So this is an example that Brad put together for Chihuahuan spruce. This is a montane species found in the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico. So here's the location where it's found and the suitable climate. And If we look at that climate going out to 2025 using that RCP 8.5, you can see that there's a pretty dramatic reduction in suitable habitat in the local environment. Pretty much disappears by mid-century. There's just a few dots in here, but probably can't even see in this room. But that climate now occurs in other locations, here in California and Southern Oregon, and here in the Northeast Texas and Oklahoma. I'm not really familiar with that area, so I'm not sure why that climate matches, but it does. And then looking into the future, you can see again there's kind of an expansion of that suitable habitat. So that might indicate, where, if you were really concerned about that species, you might be able to move seed sources to these locations and establish some, ex situ conservation plantings. So the conclusions here. So addressing climate change is a risk. Climates are warming and they're expected to continue to warm, more so in the north than in the south. In the short term, the next decade or so, local populations are adapted to the local climate. They're within the range of those current transfer guidelines. But in the long term, the local populations are at a high risk of maladaptation to projected climates, and especially as that are species that are at the warm edge of their range. So, and the adapted populations may be found at lower elevations or further south. But we need to balance the adaptation to the present conditions with adaptation to the future conditions. So this is kind of a moving target. If we only plan for those climates that are, end of century, those, stand establishment is a really critical phase. The seedling stage is the most vulnerable stage for trees. And if we, aim too far out at the end of the century and plant sources that are adapted to that environment, there's a high likelihood that we may see frost damage in the current because they're not going to be adapted to the current conditions. So we can use mixtures to account for this uncertainty and climate change over the lifetime of the stand. So we can plant a majority of material that's adapted to the local climate, and then smaller amounts that are adapted to predicted future climates. But I think the key take-home message is that we look at those seed sources that are within, that maybe they are adapted to a slightly warmer climate, but the range includes the current climate, and that will help to ensure that they are adapted to the current climate. And start planning for future seed needs for warming climates. For small land, private forest land owners, this may not be as much of a consideration, but certainly when we talk to government agencies and things like that, considering gene conservation activities, to help conserve genetic diversity in the future. So this is just some acknowledgements, some of the various people that were worked with Brad in developing these tools. Glenn Howe at Oregon State University, Nicholas and Brendan, these are the software engineers. They were the ones that have done all of the actual programming and the GIS work for the species habitat tool and the seed lot selection tool, and all of the climate niche modeling comes from Tong Li Wang, University of British Columbia. Nick and Brendan, they're with the Conservation Biology Institute. They are the ones that have basically, Brad and Glenn worked with them to actually build these models and these tools. And then so Brad was just ended with this quote from Gifford Pinchot: "The vast possibilities of our great future will become realities only if we make ourselves responsible for that future. So I think that's kind of a good message, to end on as we look forward into the future and adapting to climate change.